Welcome back, everyone. Today we're looking at one of the worst Boros decks I've ever seen. Am I being hyperbolic? Maybe a little, but this deck still needs a lot of help, so we're going to take a look at it and use it as a learning tool so we understand what not to do when trying to build our own Boros decks, and this will be through the lens of the new Aurelia, Aurelia Above the Law.
I never broke the law. I am the law.
So let's start right here. This is the article. It's on EDH Rec. It's called Two Specific Top 10 Learning to Love Battalion. Doug battles a Boros combat mechanic. Can you build a good battalion deck? And the answer is, I can, but I don't think you can. But if you watch till the end of this video, you'll probably have a good understanding of what you need to do to get yourself there. So I might be a little mean, but it's all in the sake of learning. So let's get going. So right here we see, I have always hated Battalion, and he basically goes on to talk about how Battalion requires you to overcommit your creatures to the board, and then someone plays a board wipe, and then life goes terrible. I suppose we should read Aurelia Above the Law before we get too far into this. So this is the commander we're building around. 5 mana for a 4/4, Flying Vigilance Haste. Whenever a player attacks with 3 or more creatures, you draw a card, and that is any player. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia Above the Law does 3 damage to each of your opponents, and you gain 3 life. So the most important thing is going to be triggering that card draw, but as the board gets crowded later on, you will be getting some direct damage and some life gain, so nice bits of value there. And I've already done a full video on how I would build Aurelia Above the Law, but I think this article and this deck list is going to be a good example of the common pitfalls that people run into when building a Boros deck. So we'll skip past a few more. He talks about a few cards right here. So first they look at the search, and he's searching Boros creatures costing 3 mana or less, which can create tokens, and he's ordering the results by EDH Rec score, so he's not going based on like opinion or feel or anything like that. And so we see the results of cards that get returned, and on the whole, I like these cards. I myself would run most of these. Brimaz tends to get a little weird sometimes because the token always dies if you don't support it, but it's okay. I'd probably still run it just because there isn't a lot of places to run Brimaz, and this would be a pretty good one for him, so I just think he's a cool card. Mob War Marshal is one that I definitely don't care for, but the rest of the creatures in this top 10 I actually like a lot, and I would definitely run all of these. They talk about some honorable mentions. He does have this small paragraph on Doom Traveler right here, and I do think that this is one of the areas where he's kind of going wrong with his building. He's mentioning the efficiency of Doom Traveler. The issue is that at any point after like turn 1 or 2, Doom Traveler is basically a dead card, and the only thing it's really gonna do is feed a Skull Clamp, which isn't even in this deck, and like definitely should be. And that gets into some of the other reasons, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. Like, it's not that Doom Traveler is necessarily unplayable, it's not gonna help what this deck is trying to do. So anyway, we see the deck list here. It's called Three's Company, and as I understand it, I don't think there's anything over 3 CMC in the deck other than the commander, which is, it's cute, but it's so terrible. Like, you wouldn't do this with any other commander that you build, would you? Why do it with the Boros deck? So I'm not thrilled about the approach. I think it's a flawed approach, and if he's trying to win the game with 3 drops or less, that tells me that he's trying to play this deck like he would play Red Deck Wins in Standard, and that's just not how you build your commander decks. Like, they're different formats, they want different things. And even then, I've played a lot of Red Deck Wins in Standard, not recently, but in the past, and I remember running 2 copies of Goblin Dark Dweller in there. It's a 5-drop and recast 1 of your burn spells. It was super nice, and it helped finish the game. Like, a couple 4 or 5 drops in your Red Deck Wins decks are still usually warranted. Remember Glorybringer? That thing was everywhere, right? That's a 5-drop. So like I said, I think the initial approach here is kind of flawed, and you really should be using things bigger than 3 mana. And so I'll try to give advice on how I would proceed, even if I was going to stay to the 3 CMC or less caveat, but also include some of the stuff that if I would normally use above 3 CMC. And so one of the main things looking at this deck, it's not about what's in this list, it's about what's missing from this list. And there's quite a bit, and we'll go through it. So anyway, let's take a look at this list. So the first thing that jumps out at me is 43 creatures when I looked at this, and that's a lot of creatures. I would not run that many creatures, very personally, especially in Boros. In a green deck, you can do it. It does work, but I wouldn't do that in a Boros deck. There's like too many other good things that aren't creatures. And importantly, you want some permanents left over if a board wipe goes off. And if you're running 43 creatures, I promise you, you're gonna get crushed by board wipes. Now, there is card draw in the command zone, and that is a nice thing, but that's not gonna solve all of your issues. There's a lot of like mana tempo problems that are still gonna come up as a result of that. So anyway, I've gone through and counted all the stuff in the deck that I usually care about when I look at decks, and I came up with about 14 pieces of ramp, which sounds like the right number, but as you actually look at the quality of those ramp pieces, I'm not thrilled about them. For example, we see an Impulsive Pilferer right here. It's a 1-drop that dies and makes a treasure token. Is that really ramp? I don't love calling it that. And so I don't think this is an Impulsive Pilferer style deck. There's definitely a time and a place for this card, and I'm not convinced that this deck is it. And as we look at the ramp, there's a bunch of things that are missing. So the first thing that really jumped out at me is no Signets, no Talismans, no Soul Ring in the deck. I would definitely add those in. I run Thran Dynamo in every deck that I play because mathematically it's that good. And the only real, consistent ramp that I've seen in this deck is Sword of the Animist, which puts a land in every turn, which I like, but there needs to be more of these effects. You need that continuously producing ramp. A lot of the ramp in this deck is very treasure-based, things like Prying Blade, like Golden Vein Pick. And I don't mind treasures, treasures are fine, but you do also need to make land drops and ramp your lands, and or at least just have some signets, things that aren't going to immediately get blown up by board wipes, and or Prying Blade counts on you hitting a player, which at some point in the game that's just going to be harder to do. So first off, if you want a Sword of the Animist, you probably want Bitterthorn Nissa's Animist also. And because I basically run it in every Boros deck now, Sword of Hearth and Home is just going to be amazing, so I would also run that, in addition to all the Talismans, Signets, Soul Rings, so on. There is one very notable piece of ramp missing from this deck. That's going to be Oketra's Monument. This is both ramp and makes you free tokens with Vigilance, which is going to be insane for this commander. You can also run Hazoret's Monument if you want to, but I would consider Oketra's Monument necessary. You just wouldn't want to build a deck without this, especially given this many creatures. Moving on from that, the next thing is card draw. I counted 4 pieces of card draw in the deck beside Aurelia, which is not going to be enough, and I've already hinted at it. Skull Clamp needs to be in this deck. This deck has a million tokens in it. It's basically a crime that it's not in here. It's one of the most busted Magic cards ever printed. But beyond that, there are a whole bunch of other card draw options available. I'm going to post a bunch up on screen here. And the one that I have to talk about, because I never play a deck without it, is Mask of Memory. It's just too good, and especially for a deck that wants to be attacking, especially when your commander has flying, and probably a few other things in the deck have flying as well. Mask of Memory, so good. So yeah, the deck is going to want much more card draw in addition to Aurelia, because it is just very easy for Aurelia to get shot, and then you have basically no card draw, and that'll be a really bad time. And that's basically going to be the entire point of this exercise. So in a vacuum, this deck can work, right? You lay down a bunch of creatures, and at some point you attack with them, get enough damage in. But when you start looking at practical situations, the thing that this deck fears more than anything else is a board wipe. So the changes that we're going to be making are going to give us more game against practical situations of, we want to be okay if a board wipe goes off, right? It's the thing we fear, but we should be able to play around it through ramping, card draw, protection, etc. So anyway, lots more card draw. The next thing in the main 3 that I always focus on, we've covered ramp, we've covered card draw, the third one is removal. This deck has 4 pieces of removal, and that's just not going to do. So even if we're staying on theme, one of the things I would look at a couple ETB creatures. Skyclave Apparition, for example, is a 3-drop, and exile's a thing. Love it. Durgar Hedgemage, same sort of idea. And there's many more of these that I'm sure we could get into, but that gives you an idea that, yeah, you can still be running a lot of creatures and still have the appropriate amount of removal that you should be running. So this deck needs way more removal. I wouldn't necessarily get carried away with board wipes. I might look at more one-sided options. We can talk about it now, I guess, because it kind of fits in both categories, but Winds of Abandon should definitely be in this deck. Because this is not only removal, it is also a finisher in the late game. If the board's really crowded, you have a bunch of stuff out there, and you just need to get blockers out of the way, Winds of Abandon is insane. So we'll start with what I think is probably the most important thing for a deck like this, aside from the 3 things we just talked about, and that's going to be finishers and extra combats. There's basically none of either, and that's going to be a real problem. With a deck like this, you need ways to finish the game, and you need extra combats, because that's where your damage is going to come from. So sticking to 3 mana, the finisher situation does get a little bit rough, but 2 things that I did come up with off the top of my head are Mercadia's Downfall, which we'll look up because I'm sure no one remembers that card. Mercadia's Downfall, attacking creatures get +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the number of non-basic lands defending player controls. So there's going to be a little bit of variance in there, but if your opponent's running a bunch of non-basics, that should get you a decent amount of size on your creatures, all for 3 mana at an instant. The other one that I thought of just off the top of my head is going to be Haze of Rage. Creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn, and it has Storm, so if you're laying down all those 1-drops, which this deck has a lot of, you could potentially get the Storm count reasonably high on this thing. To again, make sure you're able to get enough damage through so your creatures can win the game. The other thing that's missing when I say finishers is also going to be evasion effects. And these get tougher to come by at the 3 mana slot. For a deck like this, here's the first couple things that I've thought of. It's going to be your Master Warcraft, Cosmotronic Wave, Bond of Discipline, Akroma's Memorial. Again, all outside of the 3 CMC. Winds of Abandon, though, is 2 CMC, which would work. There's some other interesting finishing options, too, like Throne of the God Pharaoh could be a finisher to be able to get that life loss through if you just turn all your stuff sideways. Does not pair well with Vigilance, so keep that in mind. Akroma's Will tends to be one of the best these days also, but yeah, I can't stress how important that evasion is, so even if you have a big board state, you need to be able to get it through. And there are a lot of things that do this in Boros, sadly most of them above 3 CMC. But it's still something that you absolutely need a couple copies of for this deck. The next one that's also going to be really tough that's in this category is Extra Combats. And at 3 mana, there is not a lot of them. Combat Celebrant is one of the few that I can think of. The other ones get much riskier. That's going to be your Chance for Glories and Final Fortunes of the world. If you really want to stay hard on that theme, I might look into some of these, right? Yeah, they're risky, and yeah, they can go wrong in a lot of different ways, but if you're set up, that extra turn could win you the game, right? And you'll very much want to make sure your opponents are tapped out before you play any of these things. But yeah, the extra combats are super important to make sure you're getting enough damage through. And like I said, it is just harder at 3 CMC. Above 3 CMC, you get all kinds of wonderful stuff, like OG Aurelia, Mirage. Actually, Aggravated Assault is 3 mana. I know it's not cheap, but I don't know what he didn't specifically say there was a budget for this deck. It's $4 now? Oh my god. I'm going to buy 100 copies of that. Yeah, Aggravated Assault is $4 and 3 mana, so run Aggravated Assault and Combat Celebrant, right? You need some extra combats in here. Those are 2 options that will also actually give you the ability to win a game with this deck. Next thing we're going to talk about is pump effects, and we'll lump this together with token support. So I've talked about this many times in the past as we see the Doom Traveler. So Doom Traveler is going to have the same problem that a lot of our tokens are going to have, is that once basically any creature hits the board on our opponent's side, this is no longer a valid attacker, right? It's just going to get eaten by something, and there's just rarely an incentive to attack with it. So the way that you get around that is by, you either need to make like a crap load of them so they can't block at all, or you need to make them bigger, you need to give them keywords, you need to be able to support them. And one of the main issues I see with this deck right now is that this deck, all it does is make a bunch of tokens and like doesn't support them in any meaningful way. That is like one of the underlying problems with this deck, is that the second there's blockers on the board, Doom Traveler does nothing, right? Again, the only thing it would do is feed a Skull Clamp. There's not even a Skull Clamp in this deck. So you need to support your tokens, and in this case, even just your small creatures. Are Anthems my favorite? No, but for a deck with this many creatures, you'd actually get pretty good value out of them. And actually, so I want to talk about this too. I get that the deck is trying to stay to 3 CMC, but like, if you cast one Elish Norn is going to be more impactful than like, I don't know, 5 different creatures of this deck combined, right? Like, Elish Norn is a massively powerful card and the best Anthem in the game. And like, casting just one of these would be more valuable than like the 5 things in your hand most of the time. And that brings me to one of the other issues with this deck, is that you're not getting like a ton of board impact out of any single creature in this deck. Yeah, when there's a lot of them, they can start to matter, but Elish Norn is like singularly impactful. You cast it, and then even if you don't do that much else, you still have impacted the board in a very powerful way. Mog War Marshal, not exactly doing the same thing. Anyway, so there's a million Anthems in the game. One of the ones that I actually thought was kind of interesting for this deck would actually be Paladin class. It's very cheap, so it's on the theme of what we're doing. It's got the Anthem at the 2nd level, and at the 3rd level we get that nice pump effect, which is going to be really good with all the creatures we have. So I actually really kind of like Paladin class for this deck. And so there are many more Anthems in the game. There's many things at 4 CMC, like your Ajani Goldmanes. Felidar Retreat is an insane card at 5. You got Cathar's Crusade. Any of that stuff is all going to be amazing. Doesn't fit for the theme of this particular deck, but I would absolutely run those things in my own Aurelia deck. The other thing that we need to do with tokens is you need some sort of Iroas effect, and these get a little bit tough at 3 CMC or less. Because the key is, as you're attacking with these tokens, and let's say like a Brimaz where the token comes in attacking, you need to keep those tokens alive, because even though just like losing a 1/1 doesn't seem like a big deal, it does pile up over the game. Like the difference between you having like, I don't know, 5 1/1s and 10 1/1s over the course of a couple turns because you either did or didn't lose them during combat is going to be pretty meaningful. So Dolmen Gate is going to be the best one for 3 CMC or under. I'm not personally aware of any other options, though I didn't look extensively, but definitely going to want yourself a Dolmen Gate for 3 CMC or less. For above 3 CMC, I'm probably running at least 3 of these. You got Dolmen Gate, you got Iroas, and you got Loyal Unicorn is at least where I'm starting. Reconnaissance actually also works too, and also gives you pseudo vigilance, which is nice as well. So yeah, with tokens, it's important that you support them. Having like 4 or 5 1/1s with no additional support on them is not going to do that much for you. Most of the time, those just end up getting used as blockers for stuff, or if you have a Skull Clamp, fed to a Skull Clamp. Also, just thinking about like the massive number of creatures and tokens in this deck, you could totally run like an Ashnod's Altar and probably get like a crap ton of ramp out of that. What do you do if you have like 5 1/1s in play and not like a lot of support for them? You play an Ashnod's Altar and get a ton of mana, right? And so the final thing that I'll talk about today that's also missing from this deck that should like definitely be in here is protection. I see one flawless maneuver in the deck. That's scary, right? The thing that this deck loses to is a board wipe. For a deck with this many creatures, I would say you need at least probably 6 board wipe protection spells in this deck. Like, you want to have one in your hand or on board at all times. So obviously the first and best one is Teferi's Protection. This thing wins many games, right? Like, it is a game-winning card a lot of the time. But that one is expensive, so I get it. If we want to stay on theme of low CMC creatures, Selfless Spirit is going to be a really good one. And like, I would say this is a must run. If you're running 43 creatures in a deck like this, you should absolutely be running this thing. Same sort of thing is going to be Guardian of Faith. 3 mana creature, saves a bunch of our stuff, saves tokens because it's phasing, and tokens survive phasing, which is great. But yeah, this deck needs to be running way more board wipe protection than it is. Like, it will just get crushed by board wipes. And if I didn't have the budget for Teferi's Protection, I would go for an Eerie Interlude, right? Eerie Interlude is pretty good. It's going to keep a lot of your stuff alive. Fits the theme of 3 CMC or less. If you're running Eerie Interlude, you can also run Ghostway, right? There are a lot of options in white to protect your stuff, and you should be running many of them in a deck with this many creatures. Because like I said, the thing you're going to lose to is a board wipe. Before we finish up, here's a few other random cards that are going to be insane for this deck. Dark Dweller Oracle for insane amounts of impulse card draw. It's not in our theme of 3 CMC or less, but Mob Rule is an insane card most of the time anyway, and with this many creatures, it'll be game winning. So anyway, we don't need to go on forever about this deck. Well, I'll wrap up the main points here. Again, it's not what's in the deck, it's what's missing from the deck, and that is high quality ramp. It needs a lot more card draw, and again, there are many creature-based options now. It needs more removal, and again, many creature-based options. In fact, that's true of most of these categories at this point. They're printing like 4,000 cards a year. You can get most of the effects you need on a creature body now. Like, I could definitely build a much tighter 63 creature version of this deck that isn't just going to get immediately annihilated by a board wipe. And you know what? I might include that deck list right here. So I've included 3 deck lists in the description below. That's going to be the 63 creature version of the deck, that's going to be the updated 3 CMC version of the deck, and that's also going to be the no holds barred full power token list that I'm probably going to end up running on day 1 as soon as it's available. So be sure to check those out. But yeah, the other things that are missing from this deck that are super important, that's going to be your token support so that they get bigger and so they don't die in combat. That's going to be your extra combat so that you have damage. That's going to be your evasion so that you can get that damage through once your board is set up. That's going to be those protection effects so that you don't get crushed by a board wipe. We didn't really talk about it, but you're going to want better recursion also. But yeah, the main idea is, even if you're building a Boros deck, even if you're building on like a weird theme or building on a budget, your deck still needs to do certain things to really be able to hold into a commander game. And like I always talk about, that's going to be your ramp, your removal, your card draw, and then, for this case, your protection, your token support, your extra combats, and your evasion. So anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, feel free to comment, like, or subscribe. Thank you for watching.